Imagine working in a morgue, and suddenly, terrifying things start happening. What would you do? I am the Lord of Limbo, and tonight, I'll share 2 accounts from people who live through these kinds of experiences. I hope you enjoy. Now, turn off the lights. My name is Edgar. I've worked at the morgue for about 3 years now. I know what you're probably thinking. Morgue workers must get used to seeing dead bodies all the time. Well, let me tell you, the job isn't as simple as that. It's not the bodies themselves that mess with your mind, it's the strange, inexplicable things that happen around them. The things you can't explain away. But you don't get to talk about it. People would call you crazy, and you'd probably lose your job. So, you keep it to yourself. At least, that's what I did, until the night I saw something I couldn't ignore. The morgue I work at is tucked away in a part of the city that most people avoid. It's an old building, cold, with the faint smell of antiseptic that never really leaves the air. The main room where the bodies are stored is large, with several metal drawers lining the walls, their dull, reflective surfaces giving everything an eerie, hospital-like feeling. The fluorescent lights flicker sometimes, but I just chalk it up to old wiring. The back hallways are narrow, almost claustrophobic, and the only sound you hear is the dull hum of the fridge keeping the bodies cold. I was working the late shift one night. Just me and a few other night staff, nothing out of the ordinary. The body count had been low recently, which meant the shifts were slower, but it also meant I had more time to myself. The silence made me think about things I usually try to ignore. I guess that's why, when I noticed the temperature in the morgue drop unexpectedly, it caught my attention. It was around 2 a.m., and I was sitting at my desk in the back office, flipping through some paperwork. The heat had been working fine that day, but now, I could feel the cold in my bones. It wasn't a gradual drop, either. It felt as if someone had just flicked a switch. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and the chill felt wrong, unnatural. The morgue's temperature is supposed to be cold, sure, but this was different. This was almost as if the room itself was drawing in the cold from somewhere else. I stood up, rubbing my arms, and walked out of the office into the main room. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it had become. Normally, there's the soft buzzing of the fridges or the rustling of sheets as the night staff goes about their work, but tonight, it was just silence. No hum, no movement. I walked toward the nearest drawer, a habit I've developed over time, to check on the bodies inside. There was nothing out of the ordinary, just the cold, metal surfaces reflecting the overhead lights. But when I turned to head back to my desk, something caught my eye. Just a flicker in the corner of the room. A shadow, moving against the grain of the light. I paused. The hair on my arm stood up, and I felt that strange, tight sensation in my chest, like something wasn't right. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe I was tired, maybe I had imagined it. But then the shadow moved again. I walked closer to the source of the flicker, closer to the long row of drawers on the far wall. The movement was slow, deliberate. Almost as if it was waiting for me to notice. And then, I saw it. In the very corner of the room, near a stack of unused sheets, there was something that shouldn't have been there. It looked like a person, but it wasn't quite a person. It was just wrong. Its outline was faint, like a mirage, shifting in and out of clarity. Its shape seemed to bend and distort, as though the air itself was warping around it. I froze. I couldn't explain it, couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. Was it a trick of the light? I blinked rapidly, trying to clear my vision, but when I opened my eyes again, it was still there, closer now. I couldn't move. My legs felt like lead, and my heartbeat rang in my ears. I was rooted to the spot. It wasn't until the figure seemed to lean forward, just slightly, that I broke out of my trance. I turned and bolted back to the office, shutting the door behind me and locking it. I sat there for a while, trying to catch my breath. My hands were shaking. I wanted to believe it was just fatigue, maybe the stress of the job getting to me, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I checked the room again after a few minutes. The shadow was gone. There was nothing out of place. I made sure all the doors were locked, checked the surveillance cameras. Nothing unusual showed up. It was as if whatever I saw had never been there. But I knew it had. The rest of the night dragged on. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, that something was just waiting for me to let my guard down. I kept hearing strange noises, footsteps, whispers, the soft sound of metal scraping against metal. I'd glance up, but there was never anything there. Just the shadows stretching across the cold tiles. I told myself I was imagining it, that the stress of the job had finally caught up with me. But I couldn't deny what I'd seen. The shape, the way it moved, too fluid, too unnatural. The strangest part, though, was that I wasn't the only one who had experienced it. Later that week, I was talking to a colleague, someone I trusted, and the subject of strange happenings came up. He looked at me, his face pale, and said, "You saw it too, didn't you?" He wasn't talking about a ghost or anything dramatic, he was talking about that shadow. The one that watches. The one that bends and twists like it's not quite part of this world. Apparently, it had been seen by others who worked in the morgue too. Each person described it differently, but the core details were always the same, something moving in the shadows, something that shouldn't be there, something that was waiting. And after that night, I began to notice it more and more. The shadows seemed darker, heavier, like they were alive, watching from the corners of my vision. I couldn't shake the feeling that the morgue itself was inhabited. I've been trying to make sense of it all. I've told myself that it's just my mind, playing tricks on me. But I don't think it is. There's something in that building, something that I can't explain. I can't say for sure what it is, but I know it's there, lurking just beyond the reach of the light. And I'm not sure how much longer I'll be able to keep working here, knowing that whatever it is, it's waiting for me. Story 2. My name is Blake. I've been working in a morgue for over 2 years now. I guess, after the first few months, you get used to the routine, the constant cold, the sterile smell that hangs in the air, the quiet hum of the refrigeration units that never seem to stop. But there are things that happen in places like this, things that you can't explain, that make you question everything you know about the world. The truth is, there are things in the morgue that should not be there. I know that sounds crazy, but I swear, I've seen them. I remember my first night shift like it was yesterday. I was fresh out of training, still naive about the kind of things I'd experience. The morgue I work in isn't one of those modern, clean, and brightly lit facilities. This one's old, really old, and it's tucked away in a part of town that's almost forgotten by everyone. The hallways are narrow, dimly lit by flickering fluorescent lights, and there's always this weird hum in the air, like the building itself is alive in some strange way. The walls have seen better days, and the floors creak as you walk, making every step feel like an echo in a forgotten graveyard. That first night, I was doing the usual, checking bodies, ensuring everything was in place, making sure nothing was out of the ordinary. The place was quiet, as it always is at night. The only sounds were the occasional soft shuffle of paper or the clicking of my pen on a clipboard. It wasn't long before I noticed something off. I was in the autopsy room, going through some old files, when I felt it, a sudden drop in temperature. It wasn't like the normal chill that comes from being surrounded by refrigerated rooms full of bodies. This was different. It felt like someone had opened a freezer door directly beside me. I looked up, and for a moment, I could have sworn I saw something in the corner of my eye. A figure, just standing there. But when I turned to look, the room was empty. I shook it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. It was late, I hadn't had much sleep, and the morgue can play tricks on your mind. So I continued with my work. But then it happened again. This time, I was walking down one of the narrow hallways, near the storage area where the bodies are kept. There's a small alcove just past the refrigeration units where we keep extra supplies. I was passing by it when I heard something, a soft, almost inaudible scraping sound. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct, like metal dragging across metal. I stopped, thinking maybe a door was loose, but everything seemed in place. Then, I heard it again, this time from directly behind me. I spun around, but nothing. The hallway was empty. I stood there for a few moments, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. I walked back to the office, convinced it was just the stress of being in the building so late. The rest of the shift passed without incident. But that night marked the beginning of things I couldn't explain. Over the next few weeks, the strange occurrences continued. Sometimes, I would hear faint whispers coming from the back rooms, like a conversation happening just out of earshot. Other times, I'd feel a heavy presence following me as I worked, like someone was always standing just behind me. But the worst part? The bodies themselves. At first, I thought it was my imagination running wild. But more than once, I found the bodies out of place. Not by much, but just enough that it made me wonder if someone had been tampering with them. A hand would be moved slightly, or a sheet would be shifted, as though the body was trying to adjust itself. I'd always double-check to make sure nothing was disturbed before I left for the night, but I began to feel like I was being watched. One night, things escalated. I had just finished preparing a body for autopsy, nothing unusual, just a routine case, when I heard something that stopped me dead in my tracks. It was a soft, almost imperceptible sound at first, like a gentle tapping. I thought maybe it was the ventilation system acting up, but it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. I stepped closer to the table where the body was lying and froze. The body's hand twitched. I swear to God, it moved. Not in a natural way, not like a living person would move. It was jerky, unnatural, like something was controlling it. The fingers flexed, then relaxed, as if testing the air. I was rooted to the spot, unsure of what I was seeing, too terrified to make a sound. But then it stopped. The body was still again. I don't know how long I stood there, just staring at it. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. I was frozen, my feet glued to the floor. After what felt like an eternity, I took a shaky breath, turned around, and left the room. I don't remember much after that. I tried to convince myself that it was a trick of the light, or maybe the body was just settling. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was still in that room, watching me. The next few weeks were a blur. I didn't talk about what happened to anyone. I couldn't. You don't talk about things like that in a place like this. I just kept going to work, each night more unsettling than the last. The whispers got louder, and the shadows in the hallways seemed to move when I wasn't looking. I began to see things that didn't quite make sense. Faces in the reflections of the fridges. Figures standing just out of sight, in the corners of the room, waiting. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I called a colleague, someone who had been there longer than I had, and I asked him straight up if he'd ever experienced anything strange in the morgue. He looked at me like I had lost my mind, then lowered his voice. "You're not the first to ask about it," he said. "But no one talks about it. Not to outsiders. Not to anyone who hasn't been here long enough." I pressed him, desperate for some kind of explanation. "What is it?" I asked. He shook his head. "You'll figure it out yourself soon enough. Just don't let it get to you. There are things in this place that shouldn't be. But they've always been here. And they're not going anywhere." I don't know what he meant by that, and I'm not sure I want to. But ever since that conversation, I've noticed it even more. The strange feeling of being watched. The bodies moving ever so slightly, as if they're trying to reach out. I'm not sure how much longer I'll last in this job. I don't know if it's the building, or the things inside it, or something else entirely. But I can't ignore it anymore. There's something here, something I can't explain. And it's watching. It's always watching. And that's it for tonight's tales. Whether you believe in the unexplainable or not, there's always a lingering feeling that sometimes, the things we can't see are the ones that haunt us the most. Stay safe, stay aware, and remember, you never know what might be lurking just out of sight. Until next time, my friends.